The teachers made a black boy play violin as a joke, but his performance leaves them speechless. The auditorium lights were bright, almost too bright. The air felt tight, like it was holding its breath with everyone inside. A boy stood alone on the stage, his violin trembling slightly in his hands. He looked out at the crowd, rows of students in neatly pressed uniforms, teachers sitting stiffly in front, a few smirks already forming on their faces. A low laugh came from somewhere in the back, then another. He lifted the violin to his shoulder, his fingers shaking, his bow hovering. He took a deep breath and played the first note. It screeched, loud, sharp, ugly. Laughter broke out across the auditorium, quick and cruel. Some of the students turned to whisper behind cupped hands. One teacher tried to hide a smile. The music teacher at the edge of the stage gave a slow blink, then looked down at his clipboard like nothing surprising had happened. The boy swallowed hard. His name was Caleb. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not really. Not in that school. Not on that stage. A few months earlier, when Caleb got the scholarship to Westwood Academy, his mother had cried. Not because she was sad, but because she was proud. It was a big deal. A fancy private school, old stone buildings, long hallways filled with portraits of successful graduates and donors. None of those portraits looked like him. None came from where he came from. Still, they told themselves this was a chance, a way forward. But from the first day, Caleb felt it. People noticed his uniform wasn't brand new. His shoes had one small scuff. His backpack didn't have a designer label. The teachers called on other students first. The other kids acted like he was invisible, until they didn't, and then it was just to whisper or laugh. He kept his head down. He showed up early. He tried hard to blend in. Most days he felt like a shadow walking through polished halls. But there was one thing that made him feel real, his violin. It wasn't fancy or shiny. The case was old, and the name tag on it was faded. It had belonged to his grandfather, who used to play in jazz clubs around the city. Caleb learned to play on that violin when he was 6, sitting in the kitchen while his grandfather tapped out rhythms on the table with his spoon. At Westwood, the music teacher, Mr. Reynolds, hardly looked at the violin Caleb brought on the rye. First day. He raised an eyebrow and made a note. That was it. Then came the announcement. It happened on a normal morning, in the music classroom, while Caleb was tuning his violin quietly in the corner. Mr. Reynolds walked to the front and tapped, his baton on the music stand. "Attention, everyone," he said, his voice a little too cheerful. "We've got something special coming up." He paused for effect. "Next Friday, we're holding a recital for the school board and some university guests. It's a chance to show off the very best of Westwood's music program." The room filled with chatter. A few students beamed. Caleb just listened. "Everyone will perform," Mr. Reynolds said with a small smile. "No exceptions." His eyes landed right on Caleb as he said that. There was something in the way he said it, something too polite. The kind of smile that isn't really a smile. It wasn't about inclusion. It wasn't about talent. It was a setup. The students around him started whispering, "I bet he can't even hold the bow right. Wait till he tries to play in front of people. This is gonna be so good." Caleb stared at the floor. That night, he practiced for hours in the bathroom at home. The tiles made the sound echo better. His mom knocked on the door and asked if he was okay. He said yes, but the truth was, he didn't know. He kept hearing the laughter from earlier in his head, kept seeing those smirks. He wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could turn this around. But standing on that stage now, after that awful first note, he wasn't sure anymore. The lights were still too bright, his hands still shaking, and somewhere out in the crowd, someone laughed again. The laugh echoed in Caleb's ears long after he stepped off the stage. He walked quickly down the side stairs, gripping his violin like it might fall apart if he let go. His teacher didn't say a word, just gave a look that felt colder than silence. When Caleb got home that evening, the apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the fridge. His mom was working late again. He placed his violin case gently on the kitchen table and stood there for a long moment, staring at it. He wanted to put it away, hide it, maybe even forget it. But he didn't. He opened the case, touched the worn wood, and sat down to polish it with a cloth. The same way his grandfather used to. Their apartment was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, barely enough space for a full-size table. But it was clean and warm, filled with old photographs, and tiny pieces of family history. One picture showed Caleb at age 6, holding that same violin, smiling shyly with a tooth missing. Another showed his mom in her graduation gown, the proud look on her face stronger than any frame around it. Every morning Caleb woke up before his alarm, before the world got loud. Those early hours were his. He'd slip quietly out of bed, careful not to wake his mom, and tiptoe to the corner of his room. That's where the violin lived. He would practice while the sky turned from blue to orange, playing softly, sometimes only fingering the strings in silence when he was worried. The sound might wake the neighbors. The music calmed him. It made sense when nothing else did. But lately, even the music wasn't enough to drown out the pressure building around him. At school, he kept to himself. Not because he wanted to, he didn't, but because it was easier. No one invited him to hang out. No one saved him a seat. Most days he ate lunch alone in the far corner of the cafeteria. He'd pull out his sandwich and a music theory book and try to make himself invisible. He saw how the other students laughed together, talked about ski trips and tennis lessons and summer camps in Europe. They wore smart watches and shoes that cost more than his mom's monthly grocery budget. They talked about music, too, but not like he did. They talked about who their private tutors were, which competitions they'd won, how many conservatories had already emailed their parents. Caleb didn't have a tutor. He had YouTube and an old man's memories. Some teachers tried. His English teacher, for example, occasionally gave him a nod when he raised his hand, but rarely called on him. In music class, it was worse. Mr. Reynolds always found a way to point out something Caleb had done improperly, even when he hadn't. Once he asked him to fix his shirt, even though it was already tucked in. Another time, he scolded him for rushing the tempo when Caleb hadn't even played yet. It was subtle, always just enough to keep him small, just enough to remind him he didn't belong. But the recital changed everything. Not for the better, at least not yet. The minute the announcement was made, Caleb felt the shift. People began looking at him like he was already a punchline, like they couldn't wait to see him fail in front of a real audience. And the worst part? He didn't even feel surprised. He went home that night and practiced until his fingers burned. He played scales until he couldn't stand. He taped his music sheets to the wall because there was no room for a proper stand. He even practiced fingering while riding the bus to school, using a ruler as a makeshift bow. One day, he got to school, early to use one of the music department's practice rooms. He'd signed up for a time slot the day before. But when he got there, someone else was already inside. Ethan, the school's golden boy violinist. Ethan smirked and told him there must have been a mistake. "You can always try the janitor's closet," one of Ethan's friends joked. They all laughed. Caleb didn't. He found an empty storage closet near the gym instead. It smelled like old mops and cleaning spray. But it was quiet. He stood between buckets and folding chairs and played. Not loudly. He didn't want anyone to hear. Just enough to feel the notes move through his body. Just enough to remind himself that he could still feel something. Halfway through his piece, the door creaked open. Caleb froze. He expected a teacher, maybe even a security guard, but it was the janitor. The old man stood there, head tilted, listening. I thought I was imagining. That, he said with a faint smile, sounded like someone was telling the truth through a violin. Caleb didn't know what to say. He just nodded. The janitor gave a slow, knowing look. You keep playing, son. Doesn't matter where. Just don't let them take that sound away from you. And then he walked off, pushing his cart down the hallway. That moment stayed with Caleb the rest of the day, because for once, someone had heard him. The next morning, Caleb stood outside the school building, his breath puffing in the cold air. The stone walls of Westwood looked taller than usual, like they were built to keep people like him out. He adjusted his secondhand coat and walked up the stairs, violin case slung over his shoulder, head down. He passed groups of students clustered by the doors, laughing, texting, sipping coffee someone's driver probably picked up. No one looked at him, or if they did, it was with that same half-smile that said more than words ever could. In the music room, Mr. Reynolds was already waiting. He was flipping through sheet music at his desk, pretending to be too busy to notice Caleb walking in. But he noticed. "Ah, Mr. Williams," he said finally, not looking up. "Don't forget, we've only got a few days left before the recital. I assume you've selected a piece?" Caleb nodded. "Yes, sir." "Wonderful," Reynolds said, finally raising his eyes, voice dipped in sarcasm. "Nothing too urban, I hope. We're trying to maintain a certain standard." Caleb felt a flash of something in his chest. Anger, maybe. But he kept his face still and walked past to his seat. From across the room, Ethan glanced up and gave him a smug little wink. Like they were both in on the same secret. Only Caleb wasn't laughing. After class, Caleb lingered outside the teacher's lounge, waiting to ask another teacher for extra credit help. As he waited, he heard voices inside. "He's going to embarrass himself," one said. Mr. Reynolds, unmistakably. "But that's the point, isn't it? Let them see what happens when you lower the bar." "Careful," another voice warned, laughing nervously. "It's still a school-sponsored event." "That's what makes it perfect," Reynolds replied, with a note of satisfaction. "We let him play. They see the gap, and nobody can say we weren't inclusive." Caleb stood frozen in place, his heart thudding. They didn't just expect him to fail. They were counting on it. His failure would prove their point, that he didn't belong. That scholarship kids were just decorative, tokens. That night, he didn't eat dinner. He sat on his bed with the violin in his lap, hands resting on the wood. His room was quiet. From the other side of the wall, he could hear his mom humming while she folded laundry, her voice tired but still sweet. He knew she was proud of him. She still believed this school meant something better. But how could he tell her what they were doing to him? That his success had already been decided for him, by people who had never heard him play a full song, but still thought they knew everything about him. He opened his laptop, the old one that froze every few minutes, and searched for videos, tutorials, sheet music. He picked a piece he'd been working on secretly, a simplified version of Vivaldi's Winter. It wasn't flashy, but it was honest. It had tension, struggle, hope, all the things he felt every time he held that violin. The video kept buffering. Every few seconds, the sound would stutter and freeze, and Caleb would have to pause and wait. But he didn't quit. He rewound. He listened. He took notes. Then he picked up his violin and played what he remembered. Not perfectly, but cleaner, stronger. The next day, he signed up for the early practice room again, writing his name neatly on the timesheet. But when he showed up, Ethan and two of his friends were already inside. Ethan saw him, smiled wide, and said, "Ah, scheduling glitch. Must have missed it." "But I signed up yesterday," Caleb said, showing them the sheet. "Oops," Ethan said with a shrug. We're already set up, you understand. His friends chuckled behind him, not even pretending to be sorry. Caleb turned around and walked out. He didn't say anything. He just walked until he found another door, an old janitor's closet near the gym, unused and dusty. He slid inside, careful not to knock over the mop bucket, and opened his case. He stood between shelves of paper towels and cleaning supplies and began to play. The music was different there. Quieter, yes, but focused. Every note bounced gently off the tile walls, echoing back like an answer. It wasn't a concert hall, but it was his. He lost track of time. He didn't notice the footsteps outside the door, didn't notice the quiet knock. Then, the door creaked open. It was the janitor, the same old man from the other day. "I had a feeling I'd find you here," he said, stepping into the narrow space. "You've got a stubborn sound in you. That's not a bad thing." Caleb looked down, suddenly unsure. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. "I didn't mean to." "Stop," the man said, gently but firmly. "You don't owe me an apology for playing music. Not ever." There was a moment of silence. Then the man added, "You play with heart. Not many people do that anymore." Caleb blinked, surprised. You know about violin?" The janitor gave a slow smile. "Let's just say, I've played a few notes in my time." Then, before he walked out, he said something Caleb wouldn't forget. "They think they've written your story already, but they don't know you can change the ending." The door closed, and Caleb stood there, violin still in hand, heart beating faster than before. He lifted the bow again and played louder. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. He lay on his side, staring at the faint glow of the street lamp slipping through the curtain. His violin case sat at the foot of his bed, closed now, but it felt heavier than usual, like it carried more than just wood and strings. It carried everything. The janitor's words echoed in his mind. "They think they've written your story already, but they don't know you can change the ending." No teacher had ever said anything like that to him. No one at Westwood had ever looked at him like he was capable, just like he was lucky to be there. But this man, he saw something else. The next day, Caleb walked the halls with his head a little higher, not out of pride, but because something had shifted inside. Not a lot, just a little spark. A voice saying, maybe there's still a chance. At lunch, he went back to the janitor's closet, not to play this time, but just to be near the place where he didn't feel small. To his surprise, the janitor was already there. Not in his work clothes this time, but in a simple button-down shirt. He looked different, lighter somehow, like someone who didn't always push a mop. He smiled when he saw Caleb. "Good. I was hoping you'd come back." Caleb hesitated. "I didn't mean to—" "You didn't mean to what? Show up?" He waved a hand. "You belong here just as much as anyone else in this place." Then, he reached behind the old supply shelf and pulled out something Caleb hadn't expected. A violin case. Worn, but taken care of. The leather edges cracked but polished. The kind of case that had been places, carried stories. "You play?" Caleb asked, wide-eyed. "I used to," the man said. "A long time ago, before I became the guy with the broom." He opened the case. Inside was a violin that had clearly been loved. The strings were new. The bridge had been recently adjusted. But it had age, too. A kind of quiet wisdom. He lifted it, tucked it under his chin, and played a short melody. No warm-up, no preparation, just music, and it was beautiful. The kind of sound Caleb had only ever heard in videos. Full and warm, like it could wrap around you. When the last note faded, the man lowered the instrument and looked at Caleb. "I was trained classically," he said. "Juilliard, played with the symphony. Even taught music theory for a while, before people decided I belonged more with buckets than batons. Caleb didn't know what to say. Names don't matter, the man added. But if we're going to do this, call me Daniel. Caleb nodded slowly. Okay, Daniel. Daniel smiled. You've got a good ear, Caleb. That's rare. But you're playing on feel alone. That's dangerous in classical music. He pulled up a folding chair. Let me show you something. What followed was the first real lesson Caleb had ever had. Not a YouTube tutorial. Not a dusty book. Not a teacher scanning the room for someone else to call on. But an actual one-on-one session. Someone watching his form. Correcting his bow grip. Adjusting the angle of his wrist. Teaching him how to let the music breathe. Don't press so hard, Daniel said gently. Let the bow dance, not drag. You're fighting it. He showed Caleb how to let the weight of his arm guide the motion, how to feel the phrase instead of forcing it. Every correction made a difference. Little by little, the sound began to change. By the time the bell rang for the last period, Caleb's shoulders were tired, but his heart was light. Practice what I showed you, Daniel said as Caleb packed up, and come back tomorrow. Same time. I will, Caleb said, trying to hide the grin pulling at his lips. He hadn't smiled like that in weeks. That evening, the apartment smelled like garlic and rice. His mom had made her favorite one-pan dinner. Something quick, something warm. She was humming to herself when he walked in, wearing her old nursing shoes and a shirt with a coffee stain she hadn't noticed. You're late, she said, not looking up. Everything okay? Yeah. Stayed after school for practice, he replied, taking off his backpack. She looked over at him. You're eating, right? Not just practicing on empty? I ate. He lied, then sat down at the table. She served him a plate and joined him, resting her elbows on the table. There was a stack of bills under a nearby cookbook, and he could see the worry lines forming in her brow again. Still, she smiled. Give me one good thing from today, he thought about Daniel. The lesson. The way the notes finally sounded right. I learned how to fix my bow grip, he said. She raised her eyebrows. That's a good thing? It is, he said seriously. It's everything. She studied him for a moment, then reached across the table and squeezed his hand. You're going to do something special, Caleb, she said. You just keep playing. Don't let anybody steal that from you. He didn't say anything. He just nodded. That night, after dishes were done and homework was finished, he went into the bathroom to practice. Same as always. Same tiles, same echoes. But this time the sound was different. This time, it was beginning to feel like it wasn't just music anymore. It was a fight, and he wasn't ready to lose. The morning of the recital arrived cold and bright. Sunlight filtered through thin curtains as Caleb stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his shirt for the third time. His tie looked fine, but his hands kept trembling. He didn't say it out loud, but part of him wanted to stay home. To say he was sick, to disappear. But he didn't, because deep down, something stronger than fear had taken root. He pulled out a small handkerchief from his desk drawer, his grandfather's. The cloth was worn soft, edges slightly frayed, with the faint scent of old cologne still clinging to it. His mom had handed it to him the night before and said, he carried this every time he played, said it reminded him of who he was. Caleb folded it carefully and tucked it into his pocket. When he stepped into the kitchen, his mother was already waiting, dressed for work but running late just so she could drive him to school. You sure you're ready for this? She asked, as they walked to the car. No, Caleb said honestly. But I'm going. She smiled, proud and a little worried, then leaned over to kiss his forehead before starting the engine. Westwood Academy looked different that day, not because the building had changed, but because it was dressed up in expectation. Parents in tailored coats wandered through the lobby, board members chatted near the auditorium entrance, and a banner reading "Celebrating Musical Excellence" hung over the main hallway. Caleb kept his head down and walked backstage. The other students were already there, tuning their instruments, warming up, rehearsing their pieces one last time. Caleb found a quiet corner and opened his violin case slowly, careful not to let his hands shake too much. Mr. Reynolds walked by, checking names off his clipboard. When he got to Caleb, he didn't stop. He just smirked and said under his breath, "Try not to embarrass yourself too badly." Caleb didn't reply. Instead, he breathed in, deep and slow. And when the time came, he stepped into the wings and waited for his name. He stood on stage, just like he had in the beginning. Only now, the auditorium was full. Dozens of faces stared back at him. Parents, teachers, students, even strangers from universities he'd never heard of. Somewhere out there, his mother was watching, her face lit with pride and nerves. The spotlight hit his eyes. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like the only sound in the room. He lifted the violin to his chin, raised the bow, and played the first note. It screeched, sharp, off, loud. A ripple of laughter ran through the audience, small but clear. Someone whispered, another chuckled. One of the board members shifted in their seat, eyebrows raised. Mr. Reynolds looked satisfied. Caleb froze. The violin in his hand suddenly felt unfamiliar, like it wasn't his anymore, like it belonged to someone more talented, more worthy. He looked at the bow, then at the strings. His breath caught. Then he remembered. He reached into his pocket and touched the handkerchief. His grandfather's. And with that small touch, something clicked. He closed his eyes, blocked out the laughter, the lights, the cold room full of expectations and silent judgments. He breathed. Not the way a scared boy breathes, but the way someone does when they decide. He adjusted his stance, loosened his grip, and began again. This time, the note was soft, gentle, clean. He let it settle in the air before following it with another, then another, each more confident than the last. The melody of winter began to rise, quiet at first, then building with a quiet strength that made people stop shifting in their seats. Caleb didn't open his eyes. He didn't need to. He felt the music in his spine, in his ribs, in his hands. Every note wasn't just sound. It was his story. The silent lunches, the locked doors, the mop buckets and empty hallways. The lessons whispered in a closet when no one was watching. He played not like someone showing off. He played like someone who had something to say. By the time he reached the middle of the piece, the room was completely still. The kind of silence that doesn't come from boredom, but from respect, from surprise, from people realizing they were wrong. Somewhere in the back row, his mother sat up straighter, eyes shining. And just off stage, Mr. Reynolds' satisfied smirk had vanished. Caleb's hands didn't tremble anymore. He moved into the final section, fingers dancing across the strings, not perfect, but alive. Each phrase carried weight. Heart. The last note held in the air longer than expected. It drifted out, filled the room, then disappeared. Silence. For one perfect moment, no one said anything. No one moved. Then, applause. Not polite. Not forced. Real. It started slow, then grew. Hands clapping, voices calling out. Some stood. Some just sat there, stunned. But all of them knew something had just happened. Caleb opened his eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just stood there, violin in hand, breathing like he'd finally come up for air. Because for the first time, they weren't laughing. They were listening. Backstage, Caleb sat alone, violin resting across his lap. The applause still echoed in his chest, but the moment had passed. Now came the waiting. He could hear murmurs outside the curtain, conversations buzzing, Some excited, some hushed, some confused. He didn't know what to expect next. But it wasn't this. Mr. Reynolds approached, clipboard still tucked under his arm. His expression was unreadable, lips pressed thin, eyes narrow behind his glasses. "Well," Reynolds said, as if the word tasted strange in his mouth. "That was unexpected." Caleb didn't respond. He kept his hands gently on his violin, like it might be taken if he let go. Reynolds stared at the instrument. "May I see it?" Caleb blinked. "What?" "Your violin," he said, still too calm. "We need to examine it. There's something odd about the tone. Unusually resonant, especially for a student instrument. I'm concerned it's been altered in some way." Caleb pulled back slightly. "It's my grandfather's. There's nothing wrong with it." "Then you won't mind if we take a closer look," Reynolds said, reaching out. Before Caleb could stop him, the principal, Mr. Morgan, had joined them. "Mr. Williams," the principal said, putting a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Let's step into my office for a quick conversation." Caleb stood up, still gripping the violin tightly. Outside, the applause had faded. Another student was beginning their performance. The world was moving on, but Caleb wasn't. He followed them silently down the long hallway. At the end of it, in the administrative wing, they turned into a side room with wood-paneled walls and a thick leather chair. Principal Morgan gestured for Caleb to sit. Reynolds stood by the window, arms crossed. "This won't take long," Morgan said. "Mr. Reynolds has raised a concern regarding your performance." "I didn't do anything wrong," Caleb said quickly. His voice was steady, but his throat felt tight. "I practiced. I played. That's it." Reynolds spoke next. "Your playing today was far beyond anything we've heard from you in class. It was suspiciously advanced. Combined with the odd acoustic quality of your violin, it raises questions. If your instrument has been modified—" Caleb interrupted, his voice rising. "Modified? It's an old violin. It creaks. The case barely shuts. It's just mine." Morgan held up a hand. "This is not an accusation. It's a standard verification procedure." Caleb didn't believe that for a second. Standard procedures didn't feel like being marched into a private office and surrounded by adults who had never believed in him. At that moment, the door opened. Naomi Williams walked in, still wearing her work scrubs, her ID badge clipped to her collar. Her eyes scanned the room, her face unreadable. "I got a message from the front desk saying my son was pulled from the recital," she said. "Can someone explain why?" Morgan stood, smoothing his tie. "Mrs. Williams, we're simply reviewing a concern related to the musical integrity of the performance." "Musical integrity," Naomi repeated, folding her arms. "You mean you didn't expect my son to play that well? So now you're treating him like a problem instead of a student?" Reynolds stepped in. "We have reason to believe the instrument may have been modified." Naomi turned to Caleb. "Did you touch that violin? Change it?" Caleb shook his head. "No. I just practiced, Mom." She looked back at the men across from her. "He's been playing since he was a kid. That violin belonged to his grandfather. If it sounds better now, it's because he's been practicing in every spare moment. Morning, lunch, after school. In bathrooms, closets. He's worked harder than anyone in that room, and you know it." Morgan tried to regain control. "Mrs. Williams, this is simply a procedural matter." Naomi didn't let him finish. "No, this is what happens when a black boy surprises you. You look for the trick instead of the talent." There was a silence that hung in the air like a closed door. Naomi stepped toward Caleb and put a hand on his shoulder. "We're leaving, and we're taking that violin with us." Morgan cleared his throat. "If you do that, we'll have no choice but to suspend Caleb from music-related activities until we can resolve the matter." Naomi stared at him. "You already decided he didn't belong. You just don't like that he proved you wrong." She turned to Caleb. Let's go. He stood, clutching the violin close. As they left the office, Caleb could hear applause again from the auditorium. Another performance finishing. Another student being praised. Back in the hallway, he finally spoke. They're going to try and say I cheated. I know, Naomi said, but they're not going to win. They stepped out into the sunlight. It was still cold, but the air felt a little clearer. That night, Caleb sat at the kitchen table while his mom was on the phone with someone, talking fast, serious. He caught words like formal complaint, bias, representation. He didn't say anything. He just listened. His violin rested nearby, back where it belonged. His mom hung up the phone and looked at him. You're going to keep playing, she said, no matter what they try. He nodded, silent. Later, when she had gone to bed, Caleb opened the case one more time. He ran his fingers over the wood, carefully, with respect. He hadn't won anything. Not yet. But for the first time, he wasn't scared of the fight. Because he'd already proved something they couldn't take back. They heard him. And now they couldn't unhear it. The next few days felt like a quiet storm. Caleb still went to school, still sat in his usual seat in the back of class, still walked the hallways that suddenly felt narrower. But everything had shifted. People whispered more now, not behind cupped hands like before, but openly. Some stared, some avoided him. Others, surprisingly, nodded as he passed. The applause from the recital had rippled farther than he expected, but so had the fallout. Mr. Reynolds didn't speak to him. The music room door remained closed to him. Practice room reservations mysteriously disappeared from the schedule. It was clear. He was being frozen out. Then, 3 days after the recital, an email arrived. Not from the school, but from a name he didn't recognize. Subject: Your performance moved me. Caleb read it once. Then again, the message was from a woman named Eleanor. She said she was the director of a youth orchestra in the city and had attended the recital as a guest of the school board. She wrote that Caleb's piece, though technically imperfect, had something she hadn't seen in a long time. Soul, story, voice. She said she wanted to meet. Caleb showed his mom the email that evening. She read it slowly, sitting at the kitchen table, the same one where so many bills had been sorted, so many dinners eaten in silence. Do you want to go? She asked. Caleb nodded. She took a breath and smiled, soft and tired but real. Then, we'll go. They met Eleanor the following week. She was nothing like he imagined. Not old, not stiff. She wore sneakers and a scarf that looked hand-woven. She listened more than she talked. She didn't speak to Caleb like a teacher or a principal or a program director. She spoke to him like a musician. She invited him to audition for her youth orchestra's spring showcase. Not because of connections, not because of favors, because she believed in what she heard. And something else happened. She knew Daniel, the janitor. Daniel Whitmore? She said when Caleb mentioned him. He taught me violin when I was a teenager. He's the reason I do this work. Caleb felt his throat tighten. The man who had been cleaning floors at Westwood for years had quietly changed lives in ways no one at that school even realized. She smiled. If Daniel's been mentoring you, you're already ahead. Caleb practiced every day, not in practice rooms, not at school. Not in studios with perfect acoustics, but in the same bathroom, the same closet, the same corner of his room. Daniel continued to help him, more openly now. Once a week they met in the old maintenance room, which Daniel had quietly cleared out and turned into something that almost felt like a real rehearsal space. Music doesn't need a stage to matter, Daniel would say. It just needs to be heard. Each lesson was more than technique. It was history, culture, power. Daniel didn't just teach him how to play, he taught him why. And slowly, the music changed again. Not just in sound, but in intention. At the youth showcase, Caleb walked onto a real concert stage for the first time. Not a school assembly, not a forced recital, but a place where he'd been invited. The lights didn't scare him this time, neither did the silence. He played a piece he wrote himself. It had echoes of Vivaldi, sure, but it had something older too, something rooted. Hints of the jazz his grandfather once played, the long, searching notes of pain and hope woven together. When he finished, the crowd stood, but it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the face of the little boy in the front row, maybe 9, maybe 10, wide-eyed. And still, Caleb saw something in him. The same thing he used to feel when he watched other people play and wondered, could I ever? Now he knew the answer. Yes. Westwood never formally apologized, but they stopped calling him a troublemaker. And months later, under pressure from the board and growing whispers online, Mr. Reynolds resigned. The music department changed, slowly, quietly, not because of guilt, but because of exposure. Caleb never went back to their stage, but he didn't need to. He had found his own. Years passed. Caleb earned a full scholarship to a music conservatory. Not because of favors, because of grit, skill, soul. He played with the youth orchestra, then with local ensembles. Then, one day, on the stage of a national competition, he brought his grandfather's violin, restored but unchanged. Still a little rough around the edges, still his. Before every performance, he carried that handkerchief in his pocket. Not for luck, for reminder, where he came from, who stood behind him, and how far he had come. One summer, he returned to his old neighborhood to start a small music program for kids who couldn't afford lessons. He brought donated violins, printed music sheets himself, held classes in the basement of a community center. The kids came in quiet, but slowly the sound grew. He taught them the same way Daniel had taught him, with honesty, patience, and belief. And when one shy girl asked him why he started the program, he smiled and said, because someone once listened when no one else would. Caleb never became famous, but his music was heard, and that was more than enough, because he didn't just play to impress. He played to speak, and finally, people listened.